This is the Hofstra Radio Alumni Audio Yearbook, Volume 2, and today is March 21st, 2024. Today I have two guests with me, and that's pretty exciting. I'll let you both introduce yourselves, and if you don't mind mentioning the years that you were at Hofstra Radio.
This is Garry Armstrong. I was at the radio station late 1960, definitely beginning in 1961. I was there in some form through 1968, I'm going to say. I make a partition at 65 because at that point I was looking for work outside of the college radio station, and I started working at that point at the ABC Network Radio News. So let's say 1960 to 1968, as my mind recalls.
Okay, thank you.
I think it was before that, because you were already working at ABC when Owen was born, and he was born in May of 67.
Okay, I mean, let's stay with the numbers, and our age will factor into what we remember
I think you started
accurately.
working there around the beginning of 67.
How about your time at the station?
Okay, well, I started there, let's see, I started in 1963, and I found the radio station about a year later, so that would have probably been 1964. And I married Jeffrey Krause in 1965 and remained married to him until the very beginning of 1979. So the radio station was not an undergraduate experience so much as sort of part of my life. I was there a lot for one reason or another, sometimes just hanging around. Sometimes I was doing something. But, most of the time at that point, I didn't have any kind of a title. I was just there. But everybody knew who I was because I was Jeffrey's wife. So it wasn't like,
Everyone did know that.
I mean, I gave a lot of parties and we smoked a lot of pot.
Really memorable parties.
I mean, we smoked a lot of pot.
Brian, I think I may have mentioned when we did the first interview that I discovered the radio station when I was getting a little tour of the college. I was working at a department store in 1960, and I decided I wanted to pursue college studies. Didn't have any money. I knew Hofstra was a place I wanted to go, so I went to the campus and I met up with a Dr. Frank Easy, who we clicked right away when I told him about my interest in communications and radio in particular. And he gave me a tour, including the radio station. That was in 1960, the fall of 1960, and it was like I immediately said, "Oh, this is the place I want to be." So that was my first, really memory of being at the radio station.
And then that radio station took up, I'm sure, a lot of your time over the next, seems like 7 or 8 years, and then
That's an
obviously continuing
understatement.
on.
I spent most of my so-called student years at the radio station and not in the classrooms. I remember when I signed up for each succeeding semester, I had all of these courses, the basic courses, and I found myself in the radio station sending excuses to my professor saying, I'm busy doing this or busy doing that. I'm sorry. And all that time was at the radio station, usually uh, in the record library to begin with, and then later on working as the news director, typing up with two fingers, typing up the daily schedule.
Hmm.
But that's how the career began at WVHT.
So, Garry, you mentioned that you were news director. Just to remind the folks listening, what other titles or positions did you have at the station?
Okay, the first one would have been record librarian. The second one, and I don't recollect. Oh, I do recollect. As I was working in the record library, someone would say, we need a format. We need the schedule for tonight's shows. And I would usually be the person first cited, and I would go into the Studio B, I think it was, and sit down at the old manual typewriter, and I just slowly whack out the schedule for that evening. And then it became more and more permanent. And Jeffrey, at one point, Jeffrey Krause said, "Listen, Armstrong." He always called me Armstrong. He never
Mm.
called me by my first name. He said, "Listen, Armstrong, you're doing this well enough. Why don't you just keep doing it?" And I said something like, "Well, do I get paid?" And he looked at me and smiled and said, "No." "Well, what do I get?" And he said, "Well, Armstrong, you get a title. Now you're the news director." And in my mind's eye, I thought, wow, I'm now the news director of this station. And that's how that began. And I had that for X number of years. And at some point, we decided we needed some change in the positions. And at that point, Jeffrey decided to become the general manager. And it was like a replay of the previous scenario when he said, "Armstrong, you're now the station manager." And that was like being captain of the ship. And again, I was overwhelmed. But Jeffrey promoted me to be the station manager. I was still reporting to him as general manager.
But you had
Does that
the
make sense?
responsibility of running the ship day to day, I suppose, as station manager.
Well, that became a bone of contention between Jeffrey and Garry. Jeffrey was always used to being in charge and giving people marching orders or giving them the look. And as our professional relationship grew, our friendship also grew because we were two alpha males when it came down to the radio station. And I would send out orders about programming and this and that. And Jeffrey would walk in and say, "Who told you to move that show to that time slot?" And I would say, "Well, I'm the station manager." And he would say, "Damn it, Armstrong, I'm the general manager. I'm your boss." And I would say, "Well, I'm still the station manager and I'm still calling the shots." And he would walk out of my office saying, "Damn you, Armstrong. We'll talk about this later." We never did. If it did, it was about another argument. He didn't like my attitude, but a lot of people have said that during my professional career.
Actually, hardly anybody likes your attitude.
Nobody liked me very much. That's a steal from what is it, the Kingston Trio, or the Smothers Brothers?
Mother's
Yeah, yeah,
Brothers, yes.
yeah. Nobody liked me very much, but I'm teasing there. We got along fine.
I'm sure you did, and obviously the close relationship indicates that. Garry, do you remember were there? Do you remember who might have been program director or any other positions of management while you were station manager?
Dave Lamble, wasn't he program manager?
David Lambo became, he almost took the same road I did. He started as record librarian, and as I moved up, he soon became the news director. And I don't recall, I think I had already left the station as a full time player, and David became station manager. And as my career drifted away from the college radio station, there were more moves um, there that I was not immediately aware of. You've spoken with Tom Curley, so he's
Mm.
had some of the later parallel moves, but we all started in the record library. It's a job nobody really wanted until they discovered
Not me.
all these records that were supposed to be sorted out. A
Mm.
lot of these records mysteriously disappeared.
I started out writing the stuff that Jeffrey didn't want to write. He discovered I could write, and what's more, excuse me, I could write exactly like whoever I was copying. It was one of my weird abilities as a writer. So once I read his writing, I could write like him. It's what I did when I was working for Doubleday. Every time I wrote something, I wrote like whoever I was supposed to be writing like. The problem is nobody could write like me.
Interesting.
And Brian, that runs true through today as we are sitting here and talking to you. When I contribute to Marilyn's blogs, and you've read a lot of them, um, she will take the first edition, the piece that I've written, and then she will edit. And you can't tell where one stops and another leaves off. And almost all the time, the piece is better because of Marilyn's contribution. So what I'm trying to
That's what
say is
editors are
she has
supposed to
learned
do.
my style just as she learned Jeffrey's style.
I can't help it.
Yeah, that was a
I mean,
compliment.
it's an automatic
Yeah.
thing. I did that in elementary school, and they tried to fail me for copying it out of the book until they discovered no, I just write like the last thing I read.
One of the things we
Yeah.
learned, I know I learned, in terms we're talking just about writing now, is you don't try to write like some famous writer, J.D. Salinger or someone like that, or Ernest Hemingway. You write the way you talk. And that sounds simple enough,
Mm.
but it took a lot of trial and error. And one of the things I know Tom Curley was saying the same thing to you. One of the perks of working at the college radio station is you got a chance to make mistakes, and you learn by your mistakes. And I have a number of examples I can share with you. But one of the joys working there was doing something and you thought it was great, and as it turned out, it wasn't so great. And that was a lesson that sort of gave me backbone when I moved on to work commercially.
Mm. Um, Marilyn, I wanted to step back for a second. I mean, your talent as an editor on written word seems to come through, and I wonder if that factored into other things that you did at the station. I think it's one point you were chief announcer, and obviously, as you said before, you were involved for many years in many different ways. But did you find that ability to sort of pick up on people's writing styles translated into other things you did at the station?
Yeah, it's just one of those things that I do. I don't even know how I do it. Honestly, it's one of those gifts you get,
Mm.
which is that I was born sort of able to do, and it was very useful because when somebody was in the middle of something and they couldn't finish it because they had a test, or they had a pressing engagement like a date, or they were going down to the bar to drink and they didn't have time to finish, I could finish up pretty much anything I was given and pretty much come up with it sounding just like it would have had the person originally doing it continue to do it. And that's why I make a really good editor. I'm a much better editor of other people's work than I am of my own.
Uh,
Brian will give you a case in point here.
sure.
Marilyn just posted a piece on her serendipity, uh, and it was supposedly tongue in cheek. We had been out on a photographic mission and also had to make a couple of other stops. And this is really within the past week. And we found what I thought was a lone glove in a wooded area. And I wrote a piece called "The Mystery of the Missing Glove." And I thought it came together rather well. And I gave it to Marilyn to edit and put in photos. And when I got it back, it was a story about a missing sock, not a
Hmm.
glove. My mind had just left me, and it was inaccurate. But I had written a story playing off the missing glove. Now, Marilyn edited, rewrote, put in the photos, and it made absolute sense. It was just exactly what I wanted to say. But she saw the error, and she changed the glove to the sock, and it was as if Garry Armstrong had done the whole thing cleanly. So that's another indication of her ability to take over someone else's work and make it work cleanly.
Hmm. That's a rare talent, and it should be cherished because so many people will want to put their imprint on something or change it and say, "Well, why don't you focus on this?" or "Isn't this phrase better?" And to be able to work with someone and to build that level of trust, that's a rare thing, and it's an amazing thing. And I have some work that I'll be sending your way, Marilyn, if you could help me out a little bit with my
Well,
classroom, my lessons.
I'm a very good editor.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, it's actually the first work that I really did. Before I was a writer, I was an editor, and then I was a writer again, and then I was both. And sometimes I was the other one, you know, at
Doubleday?
no, not Doubleday, the other place,
Free
Bethpage,
Bethpage? Well, as you think about that, let me tell Brian.
NASA.
As you think about that, let me tell Brian before this falls off the loop of my brain, which is really fragmented. This ability to take someone else's work and edit it followed me through to when I was working in the show And when you're talking baseball, that's major leagues, of course. In radio or TV, the show is network. Now, at the network, one of the jobs I had was working as an editor for veteran newscasters, guys who had been around since Ed Murrow. And so you can see this young upstart editing the work of guys who were veterans. And what enabled me to do the job, and I never thought about it then, what made it easy for me to do it was the lessons that I had learned at VHC, the things that Marilyn and I are talking about that we did then that we're still doing it in retirement. So the lessons were not just in passing it in college, they've stayed with us and benefited us through all these years.
I think Jeffrey never really understood how important he was in helping people form a solid idea of where they wanted to go professionally. He was really good at it, and he never really understood how important it was.
He was an excellent mentor, and I'm sure most of the people you've talked to and will talk to. And by the way, Brian, official compliments on your diligence to doing this series,
Oh,
which
many thanks.
will give not only the current generation but the future generation some insight into the radio station and how it molded a lot of careers. So many of us have tried really to compliment Jeffrey Krause while he was still with us about how he changed our lives. I mean, I don't know that I would have had a career in radio and television if Jeff Krause hadn't been around to help me. And sometimes in his cynical one-liners at me, he was teaching me, and I understood that.
Mhm.
So that's part of his legacy and part of the overall legacy of the radio station. And we keep going back to you did things and you made mistakes, and if this had been done at another level in that business, you would have been gone. But you were in college radio, so you had learned by your mistakes, and that so very much helped me later on.
Yeah, I've heard that so many times from different people who worked with and studied under Jeff, is that he gave great career advice, and it wasn't necessarily to go into radio or TV. He certainly suggested people going into other careers or being writers or teachers or actors. But I think a common theme with a lot of things, along with what you're saying, Gary, is that someone might go to Jeff and say, "Well, I want to do this or do that. And I want to do it this way." And he would say, "Okay, go ahead and try." And they would try and come back to him an hour, a day, a week later and say, "It didn't work," or "What could be better?" And then he'd say, "Okay, now try this, try that." I think he was willing to give people an opportunity to try,
Yeah,
but he was always there to be supportive. Does it sound right?
that sounds right. And I've got a great example for you. I did a piece. I've been a long time Western fan. So at one point, and I can't remember the year. It could be the '70s. I don't really. No, the '60s. I'm sorry. I wrote a piece called "Pale Rider." Yes, that's the same title used by Clint Eastwood later
Mm,
on for a movie, but I called mine Pale Rider, and I thought it was going to be a new Zane Grey type of piece. I thought it was a wonderful take on a radio western, and I showed it to Jeffrey, and I could see that he wasn't really happy with it, and he could have just as easily said, nice try. Why don't you work up a new script? And I said, but he didn't say that. He just looked at it, furrowed his eyebrows, took a whiff of his smoke from his pipe. And he said, well, finish it up and we'll see what we can do. And I said, well, I'm ready to go. So what they did, to make the long story short, he gave me a full cast to do the show. We actually did the
mm,
show and we had corny Western music in the background. The point being, we went through a lot of time and effort for something that didn't really merit that. So he didn't say to me, try something else. He just let me do the whole thing. And then we listened back.
At
And he
the
just smiled when I looked at it and listened to it.
at the risk
mm.
of pointing out the obvious, did you ever read any of Jeffrey's writing at that point? it was even more purple than yours. The two of you together were the purplest two I've ever seen.
Well, one of the things
I
there,
improved both of you. I edited everything. I said, "Oh my God!"
Brian, I
You
always
read all those
loved,
adjectives.
there are variations of this when you're talking to people who are quote unquote talent. These days, I'm known as a guy who never walked away from a TV camera, but back then, I wanted to be this great writer. So, of course, when I wrote something and I looked at it and I proofed it, self-proofing, which is a mistake, I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And the fact that it wasn't, and the fact that Jeffrey looked at it and probably knew it was trash, purple prose, and still let me produce the whole thing is an understatement
Yes,
to, you
but he
know,
was his stuff was just as bad as yours. I'm sure he could recognize it as being from the same genre of too many adjectives, sentences that were way too long, and just purple, 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 purple,
well,
purple
it is,
sagebrush.
Brian, as you can see, we're just adding levels to this opportunity that I had that taught me a very invaluable lesson.
Yeah, well, we were
and
none of us exactly in professional mode at that point. I mean, we just were kids.
you're experimenting and trying and being students, and you don't know that you're over speaking until you've been in front of the microphone for too long and you listen back and say, gosh, I need to cut that a little bit. I think it's all part of the experience of figuring out what works and what doesn't. And
You're right.
it seems like you all had the
I have
opportunity to
too
do
many
that.
examples as I think about it. I don't want to, I don't want to put all my bad stuff on the air here, but I remember cutting a promo for a new late night show I was doing, and I did it. I thought it was really great. I thought I had mastered the lingo or the style. I hadn't. I was years away from finding my own voice, to be honest. But I cut this promo talking about a show called Long Island After Dark, or it might have been a general promo for our late night contemporary music shows. And I laid I forget what the song was, maybe Moon River or something like that. And I listened back and I realized I was trying to copy the then legendary William B. Williams from my favorite AM music show station, WNEW. And I
Mm.
listened back and I was saying things like, listen to Long Island After Dark. We have the music of Bill Basie, Count Basie. Now, no one called him Bill Basie except William B. Williams, who was top notch professional. And the notion of Garry Armstrong, a beginning student at the college radio station, trying to sound like William B. Williams, in retrospect, yes, it was ludicrous. But the point
Mm.
being, Jeffrey let it play. We used it on the air, and every time I heard it on the air, I went from being brown to being purple to being really embarrassed. But the point is, I got my chance, and I learned a lesson.
Let me point out
Mm.
something else. At the time we were there, which was pretty early, there was nobody better than we were. We were as good as the station had to offer. I mean, it wasn't like you could go to somebody more experienced, you know, with a better style. None of us had found our voices yet.
What I'm wondering, Brian, is if there's a shorter leash on those at the station now. We had a very long leash, obviously, and you can't say enough about how wonderful it was in instilling in us the sense that we could go for as far as we wanted to go. So,
Mm.
so back then, the leash was very long. The product very often didn't deserve it, but we learned, and we would go on to do better things.
I think that spirit's always existed from my time in the 1990s. There was always that spirit of someone would walk in and say, "Hey, I've got an idea," and we would jump to it and try it out. And I think during the Bruce Avery era, that there was certainly that spirit of experimentation and trying things out. And I know Ed Ingles was certainly very encouraging to young sportscasters and newscasters and say, "Hey, this was good, and let's do better on this." And I think that continues now with John Mullen and Kathleen Shortis. I think that's built into the DNA of the station, and it's a luxury to have that, and I think that's built into the station, and I think that comes from your era and has just always been passed down, whether people know where it comes from or not. I think that's just part of what it is, and hopefully always will be.
Well, it was certainly more interesting than going to classes.
Well, sure. I think that's a definite
Vastly better than
continuity.
going to
Yeah,
school.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Well,
I sort of had to make time to actually get to classes. Fortunately, I
yeah.
was smart enough to not need a lot of class time to catch up.
It is a common tale through these interviews, and someone started off as a pre-med or computer science or whatever it was, and they became radio majors and went to class less and less and less. That is definitely a story. But I want to take a moment and ask the both of you, and this might be hard to narrow down because of how important the station and the community were to you. But if Hofstra Radio, if WVHC comes up, is there a story that you always tell? Is there a story that always comes to mind first when you think of your time at Hofstra?
Yes, there's one. There's one that I always tell because it again it put me in my place, but it was also a cautionary tale for me. Howard Cosell. That name should be familiar to you.
Mm-hmm.
He was in his
Sure.
prime back then, and he was the butt of jokes, and a lot of people uh, sort of made fun of him. Also, tried to. I'm searching for the word here, folks. Imitate him, mimic him. Frank
Mm,
Gorshin used to imitate him. At any rate, we got Howard Cosell to come down to the radio station as I remember it, and I got to do the interview. And Cosell, of course, was very acerbic, and to me,
He was a mean asshole.
well, but that was one of the levels of his career. Uh, Brilliant writer, a great interviewer, but everyone remembered how how
Unpleasant.
unpleasant he was with his guest, and that's the way it felt to me, as well as all the other people who listened to him. So, at any rate, we have Mr. Cosell in Studio A, I'll say the big studio. We sat him down, and I was here's the point,
That was
Brian.
B.
Here's the point. Young Garry Armstrong was ready to take on this veteran Howard Cosell and put him in his place. So my first
mm,
question was, and I remember it 50, 60 years later, Mr. Cosell, why is it that you always put your guest ill at ease and make them feel awkward when you begin your interviews? Why do you do that? And I sat back and thinking to myself, I got this mother. I got him right where I want to. And he looked at me, and there were a few people around. There were a couple of people uh, in the engineering room, and a couple of people wandering around watching what was going on. Garry and Cosell going at it. And Cosell looked at me and said, "That is, without any pause to think about it, the stupidest, the most ignorant, the most badly worded question I've ever had put to me in my long career. Now, if you want to start this interview all over again, I'll give you that take on it, but try to be more intelligent." And I looked
wow.
up and I could see the engineer laughing. He was almost falling over off his chair, laughing at the place I had put myself into. So I took a deep breath. I was so very embarrassed. And I took his offer up. I took a deep breath and we started the interview again. I don't remember much about the interview, but I was very, very careful about where I went. I knew what my questions were and I knew where they should take me. But the lesson I learned was don't try to be Howard Cosell. Don't try to be Mike Wallace. Don't try
Mm,
to be whoever is the sharp tongue these days. Know what you're saying. But it's like when you hear that cliche in the courtroom. Don't ask a question that you're not quite sure what the answer is going to be. But that's the
right.
first thing that always comes to mind. Howard Cosell putting Garry Armstrong in his place at WVHC FM.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. And I'm sure if he answered it honestly, he'd probably say, "Well, because I can, make people uncomfortable because he was sharp enough and tough enough that he could do that." So that was his brand. But wow, thank you for sharing that. That's a great story. Marilyn, same question. Is there a story that always comes to mind when you talk about Hofstra Radio?
Not really, because for me, it was a very complicated social experience. I
Sure.
mean, Jeffrey and I kind of connected and were in a dating relationship almost immediately. Like, I don't know, minutes after I arrived.
Mhm.
I think I showed up at the door and he said, "Hi, you want to go out for lunch?" And that was, we went out for a lot of lunches after that. I mean, so it really became very much a part of my life. You know,
Yeah.
after a while, I wasn't even like so much a radio station member as married to the guy who ran the place. So,
it was a conversation, station conversation that Jeffrey was uh, seeing this young lady, and we should by no means go near her or behave in an ungentlemanly manner. But it was clear that something was going on.
yeah, he,
I have one or two others. One of them is one of these overlapping things. It involves the KKK, and I hope the name is right. After all, the name I have in my head here and written down is George Lincoln Rockwell from the KKK, and he was on
oh,
campus.
it's the
I guess,
American Nazi Party, but yeah.
yeah, he was there to. Maybe that's what I should be thinking of. At any rate, he was on campus to do whatever he was doing, and Jeffrey said we're going to do a sit down with him, and my mind was elsewhere. I didn't think he would come near me, but he said, "Armstrong, you're on this one." And I turned to Jeff. You're not going to send me to interview this guy. He said, "Yes, just get out of here." And he turned to someone else and said, "Grab the Butoba," which was one of our favorite recording devices back then. And I had an engineer, and we went over to wherever it was to interview George Lincoln Rockwell, who looked at me as I walked into the room, and he had a kind of quizzical look on his face. Why would they send a man of color over to interview him? I could read
Mm.
his mind about that. So we sat down. Now, I already had Howard Cosell in the back of my mind, so I knew I was going to be very careful. So I sat down and I said something as pleasantly as possible, as good to meet you. You have a name to be reckoned with, anything to pump him up. So we went through the interview, and he did what he did, and he was painting not only Hofstra and Nassau County and the rest of the country as being too liberal, and that more and more people were beginning to pick up his mantra, and that the country was going to be in much better shape in the immediate future. And all I said was, well, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. It also will be interesting to see how history remembers you, Mr. Rockwell. And
Mm.
I can always say I was one of the first to talk to you, and it's been my pleasure, and it's been a bit of an education for me. Thank you for talking to us. And we wrapped it
Wow.
up, and he just looked at me, and he had a pained smile on his face. And I was waiting for him to say something like, "Oh, you're one of the good ones." But he thought it, but didn't say it. But that's memorable to me because it was one of my first professional encounters with the people that we would personally prefer to stay away from.
Yeah. So was this while you were still an undergraduate, Gary?
Yeah,
Was this
yeah.
because I, if memory serves, the details are hazy. I think he was assassinated, wasn't he, in maybe 67 or 68? Was is that?
I don't remember. And I
I
look it
don't
up on my
remember either.
computer,
I
but I
know
can't.
it was before 65. This is my best recollection. I have a
Huh.
lot of stuff stored upstairs in my head, and I have, as I kiddingly say, people who work in my brain, but we can't give you the exact year. But I believe it was before 65.
Yeah, I just picturing because I think he was a military guy, and then he kind of came to prominence in the in the early mid 60s and was making his big public name. But what a confrontation, and for Jeff to put you in that situation, I imagine Jeff had a great deal of faith in you and was, wondering how this was going to play out. And it sounds like you acquitted yourself quite well. Sounds like you did
Yeah,
a great job.
I think you're right. And it took me a while to understand that's why he gave me the interview. I think he was always testing me. And
Hmm.
maybe I didn't quite realize it, but all I knew was I had to be up to the task. Obviously, I wanted to please him. I always wanted to please Jeff. He was, yeah, not only my mentor, but as it turned out, as went by, we became best friends. And we probably were the odd couple there, but he always wanted me to be better, which leads me to another quick story. I don't know whether
Hmm.
I shared this one with you the first time around, but I've always been hard of hearing, and I always had my diction wasn't very good. And on one show, I introduced a music theme, the theme from The Great Escape, which was playing in first run at that time, so it had to be 1963. And I mangled my pronunciation of the word escape. And nowadays, when I try to mispronounce it, I have problems. But apparently, I left the S out, and it came out escape. And I walked out of the
Escape.
studio, feeling really good. I had just done this cool intro to this great piece of music. And it wasn't Jeffrey, it was another staffer named Gene Snyder, who was a drama major. And Gene pulled me over and said, "Hey, Garry, I don't want to embarrass you or hurt you." I said, "Gene, what is it?" He said, "You mispronounced the word escape." And I said, "No, I said escape." He said, "Garry, you missed the S." I said, "I did?" And he said, "Yeah." And then my mind kind of did a quick whirlwind thing. And I wondered how many other words had I mispronounced, and no one took the time to tell me. My teachers didn't. Um, what I did was I went to Jeffrey and I said, "This is what Gene said," and he said, "Yeah, but you'll learn." And I said, "No, no, no. I have to do more than that. I need to do something about my speech." And Jeff said, "Well, it's your hearing that's a problem." And I said, "That may be, but I can't go around my life mispronouncing words because I can't hear them. I think I need speech therapy." And lo and behold, I got a speech therapy class, I think with someone named Lois Cruz,
Yep.
if I remember
She was
correctly.
very good.
She was very good. And so, what I'm saying here, Brian, is that a major, major part of my professional life was set in motion by going to speech therapy so I could improve my diction. And it would not have happened if I had not been working at the college radio station.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so many things that prepare you for what happens later on, and one of the questions I usually ask towards the end of the interview, and I think you've both answered this, or what are the things that you learn or take with you from your time at WVHC into your professional and adult life, and obviously the place and the people had such an impact on both of you, and it's wonderful to hear how much of a positive effect all these things had on your lives. I want to ask another general question about your time at the station, and Marilyn, if I could start with you this time. I'd like to ask if people have a proudest moment or biggest accomplishment of their time as an undergrad at the radio station. Is there something that stands out for you as
Well,
I'm pretty proud of myself?
Dr. Faustus, I was taking Elizabethan English
Hmm.
coursework, and I needed a final project. And I thought, gee, wouldn't it be interesting to take this play by, what was his name? Not Shakespeare, the other guy, Christopher something.
Marlowe?
Marlowe.
Christopher Marlowe?
Now, because it was for radio, I had, there's where my ability to write, I wrote the whole thing in Elizabethan English. All of the transiting parts, because you couldn't see anything, you're only hearing it. So I wrote long sections in Elizabethan English, and then they produced the whole thing. This is also how Teddy Ronneberger became involved in the station. He took over the engineering. and it was a really good production. And amazingly, it actually sounded Elizabethan even when I was writing it. Of course, I lost the ability to write like that immediately afterwards. Moved on to whatever else was coming up, but that was pretty good. And it also took about 6 weeks to produce it. Jeffrey played Faustus. He got very into it.
It sounds like a wonderful challenge, and I think that's the hubris of youth and deadlines, and you figure out a way to make it happen. Like we were saying earlier, a chance to experiment and try things out. It must have been a great deal of fun to do it. I'm sure it was stressful, but must have been a lot of
It
fun.
was fun to a point, and then it just became a job. I mean, because
Oh,
you couldn't do it during the day when the station was on the air, and that was still when the station was off the air. When night came on. So we had to do almost all of the production at night. And Dr. Faustus is a long play. I mean,
hmm.
it's an hour plus. And we did a little bit of cutting down, but it was still a solid hour and a quarter on the air. And, I didn't act in it. Once I finished the script, it was everybody else's child to raise.
Hmm.
I mean, I got an A for the project, didn't get an A in the course, but I did get an A in the course. That's because I memorized poetry. She was the teacher that gave you 5 points for every line of a sonnet you could remember. So I would
Wow.
memorize a whole sonnet and get 105% for the sonnet and didn't have to answer anything else.
Quite an accomplishment.
Yeah,
I,
I
I
can't remember
Impressive.
any of it now. It's all
I don't
gone.
have anything like Marilyn had just offered up to you. I do remember, and again, this is something that sort of spliced my life from VHC into professional commercial radio. But we had we were interviewing Merv Griffin. We were in that period where all we had to do was pick up the telephone and call New York and try to get a really big name. And the first big name I recall us getting was Merv Griffin, who was alive
Hmm.
and well back then. And of course, he was the godfather of quiz shows, and he still gets credit this day. At any rate, we were in his office in Manhattan, and we did the interview. And I made it a point not to talk about or not to lead off with questions about his TV shows, his game shows, but to talk about his previous professional life as an actor. He was a studio contract player at Warner Brothers, and I had known because I watched all these movies. I knew that he did a lot of the early Doris Day, Gordon McRae musicals.
Hmm.
So we were talking about that, and I was asking about Gordon McRae and yada yada, and talking about some of the supporting actors who were familiar to me. And then he's the one who danced from doing the movies to going into television because he knew that he wasn't going to go anywhere further in movies. So he got into television, and he started up the game show, which really really made his career. At the end of the interview, we were packing up, and he said, "I think that went well." Uh, and I remember he called me Mr. Armstrong, and then I nodded, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Garry. I think you have a career." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "You listened to me." And I said, "Well, that's what you're supposed to do, right?" And he said, "You'd be so surprised how many people, even people who are working at networks, don't take the time to listen. They walk in with a written list of questions. They ask question one. They don't listen to the answer. They go ahead to question two, and it's not really an interview. But you didn't do that. You listened to me." And I also like the fact that you obviously did your homework and you talked about my film career. Very few people do that, and I appreciate that. So, and then I threw in something that is it's a little embarrassing to admit, but you throw something into to sweeten up the conversations. And so I said, I thought you were just as good as Gordon McRae. Yeah, and I don't think it's really fair that you had to play second banana. And he just smiled. And he said, that's the kind of thing you do when you want your guests to open up more. So
Uh-huh.
that might have been the most fun interview. And I think the culmination of things I had learned previously at VHC to hold my own with a professional who was making his life off of talking commercially. So I have to
Mm.
tip my hat off to WVHC again. And even Jeffrey, when he heard the interview, he usually sort of made light of anything you did just to keep you in your place. But he said that was well done, and especially the fact that he has a career in broadcasting. I'm glad you didn't make us look bad. So that's my contribution to that topic.
Wow. Wow, that's a great story, and like you said, knowing your guest, knowing what you want to get from them, and listening and doing all the things. It sounds like, and I think you've said this a few times, both of you, that you're always working together and challenging each other and helping and supporting and making each other better, and that's great.
Yes, Christian.
You, Sort of going back to some things you said before, there was a lot of fun stuff. There were a lot of times and parties and things like that. Are there funny stories or funny events that always make you laugh? Is there something that happened that always gives you a chuckle to this day?
Yeah, there's one, and I'm afraid I'll be repeating it, but it's been a while since we did our first interview.
Mm,
This is the one where we had a football game. The Hofstra football team was playing, and our lead sportscaster was also a Broadway producer, a fellow by the name of High Silverman. He was not around. And the second guy who knew football was someone named Fred Motley, who was also the host of a jazz program, Jazz Till
mm.
6. Fred was not to be found. Again, the long story short, no one was around except Jeffrey Krause and Garry Armstrong, and no one in the station knew less about football than Garry and Jeff. But the scenario was set. We had to call the football game. And Jeffrey would say things like, and Joe Schwartz uh, somehow bends down and sends the pigskin spiraling through the sky. And I would jump in and say, and yes, and Joe Smith or Joe Schwartz is wearing an. It was pure hogwash. It was horrible. And we got phone calls saying, who are those guys? And we're the guys who usually do the show. We couldn't leave. We had to do the whole football game, obviously. And when we got through, the phone line was still ringing. And they didn't usually ring that frequently when the smoother sportscasters were working. And Jeffrey and I looked at each other and said, I think this was a mistake. And then someone said, well, the broadcast had to go on. You couldn't ignore it. And I said to Jeff, I wonder if there will be something that we will do that will be worse than this. And he just nodded his head and he said, I don't know. I don't know. But that was a low life. And I always will remember it because it always tells me, know your limitations. And even though you say know your limitations, you go back to that mantra of you need to make mistakes in order to be better.
And
Wow.
sometimes you don't have a choice.
And
You get
sometimes
to
you
Yeah.
do
don't have a
things you're
choice.
not good at, and you know you're not good at them, and you have to do them anyway
Right.
because somebody told you to.
Right.
And later in our lives, that usually was because somebody was paying us.
Yes.
And when they told us to do it, we did it.
Marilyn, Brian, Marilyn is, I think, hinting about some of the stories I had to do when I was working in TV in Boston. And for some reason, my bosses, the news directors, thought I was capable of doing anything. And they would send me out to, and this is serious, they would send me out to go undercover and blend in with street gangs, not just any street gang. They sent me out to go undercover and get interviews surreptitiously with the Chinese street gangs, the Japanese street gangs,
And the Vietnamese.
the Vietnamese street gangs. I mean, it was completely ludicrous. Now, despite my protest saying I don't look anything like the folks you're sending me out to work with, they would say, you can do it. Now, I had all of these things playing around in my mind, and what I would do is I'd go out to these various gang people. They would find it funny, and because they found it funny and they knew I wasn't trying to uh, put them in a bad light, they just welcomed me, and they allowed me to do what I had to do. And all those stories came out working well, much to my embarrassment, but they came out well. But it was a reminder to me that even though it seems impossible, now we're going back to the VHC days, just do the best you can. Don't push it beyond your limitation, but be yourself and do it to the best of your ability. So in those situations where clearly I wasn't the ethnicity that I was supposedly involved with, I was just myself. I just asked the questions and pushed the interview in the direction I wanted. It succeeded. And when people asked me how was I able to do that after I laughed off the legitimacy of the interview assignment, I said I have to really go back to my college radio days. And
Mm.
I repeated the story to those people that I'm telling you now.
Wow, that's amazing. That it is good advice to go ahead and try and figure out what your limits are. But gosh, the things we get asked to do, and like you say, that when there's a paycheck attached, you have to at least try. So
Yeah, it's funny how the paycheck being attached changes the whole scene.
yeah,
All of
yeah,
a
yeah.
sudden, you don't have a choice, really.
You
You
don't have a
just
choice. You
do.
also, one of the things I carried away from me is be yourself. I mentioned earlier in this interview um, mimicking other people, trying to be
Yeah.
another William B. Williams or whoever else. Once I stopped that, I think things began to work for me. And Jeff at one point said, "This is what I was talking about. You're going to find yourself." And this is why you get some of the stories you get from me. And this is why I got some of the ludicrous assignments that would get later on in life. But again, it was Jeff Krause and the people at WVHC who gave me the strength and somehow the input to know that there was no challenge that was too big. Obviously, that's contradictory. There are some stories you don't go near. You don't
Mm.
want to be that
Or
stupid.
football games. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, not football games.
I love that. Um, is there something that you miss most about your time at the station? I think we've kind of covered this, but is it the people? Is it the opportunity to experiment, to try things out? What do you miss most about being an undergrad at WVHC?
Uh, I miss the feeling that I had when I initially went down to the station and let's say my first year or two. And this goes back to the fact that I was one of the few. I don't know how many there were. I was one of the few students of color
Hmm.
attending Hofstra at that point, and I was always used to the stuff you have to deal with when you're a minority working at or studying at a predominantly white institution. So, in the back of my mind, when I went down to the radio station and started working there, I kept getting ready for somebody to slap me with some sort of racist joke or comment. And what occurred to me over those first few days and weeks and months was I was being treated like everyone else. I mean,
Hmm.
Jeff Krause called everyone by their last name, and he gave me all the chances that I told you. And it just occurred to me at some point in time is they like me, they're accepting me, and that was the first time in my life I think that I experienced that. I had worked, as I said, as a salesperson at a department store, and I sure as hell was clear of what my skin color was there. And I just thought, fact of life, you're a guy of color, and you're working at an institution that doesn't have many other people who look like you. You're going to stand out, and they're going to make you know that you're different.
Yeah, you had to wait for that until you worked in the real world.
Right. But at VHC, I was just like everyone else, and it was something I had never truly experienced before, and it was wonderful.
Mm.
It allowed me to really relax.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Marilyn, do you have something that you miss most about your time at the station?
Yeah, mostly not working. I mean, because I went from there to, well, a lot of medical stuff, and then I had Owen, and then I went to work, and I didn't stop until, that was what, 1970 when I started working, and it was 2010 when I stopped.
Wow.
Yep.
So ahead of me was a long, long line of jobs,
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I know everybody thinks that technical writing is boring, but it isn't really. Not if you're doing the kind of stuff I was doing, where you're working with products that haven't even come on the market yet. And you're working with the developers and trying to get it to work and explain it to people who have, I don't know, 3 PhDs and you've barely managed to scrape through your BA,
Yeah.
and yet you're the one explaining to them how to do it. So I thought it was pretty interesting. But I also started my actual writing at WVHC and then sort of branched out from there into some local non-paying, little newslettery places. And
Right.
It's funny how that happens. The scripts, and I'm talking about the script form, which has the copy on one side of the page, and it has in radio, obviously, it has the directions for the editor on the other side of the page. It's much like a movie script, but I don't remember how I did it the first couple of times around, but I did it. I knew there had to be a separation. The script, the narrative was always in caps, and the directions for the technical people were on the other side, and they were in small letters. But it was clear that there were two things there. It seems really simple now. And I thought after I did it at VHC that, oh, okay, that's the way things should be done. Well, when I went to both ABC Radio Net and later on into television, I used the exact same format. And at both of those commercial places, they marveled over my scripts and they said, "We've never seen anything like this before. It's really great. It's easy for us to adapt it. I don't know why we haven't had that before. Where did you learn this?" And I said, "Oh, at the college radio station." And I
Hmm.
would get blank looks. And I remember there was a fellow named Nick George who was a news program executive at ABC News, and he said, "Armstrong, are you telling me you learned to do the script that we now use? You learned this in college?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Wow, wow, we need more of these." And I said, "Well, you know where to find them, Oxford University." And that's another case of the radio station setting trends for the commercial people.
Hmm. Amazing. Um, if I could ask, this is a tough one for some people, but I'm going to ask, um, if you could time travel and see yourself at 18 years old or so, what advice would you give to yourself?
What would I say to myself as an 18-year-old?
What sort of advice or a nudge in a direction or do this or try that?
Oh, okay, okay, I got it. Um, I had just been discharged from the Marine Corps. I got a medical because of my hearing problems. So I was 18 years old, and as I mentioned, working um, as a salesman in a department store in Hempstead. And as an 18-year-old who had also just discovered the radio station, I had to deal with: do I continue with the success I have as a shoe salesman, or do I pursue this this thing with radio, and I, at that point, what I've left out, and I think it's really important here. I had this dream of becoming a movie star, and I thought maybe going into radio would lead to that. My
Mm.
parents, they were aghast because they knew I was a successful shoe salesman, and there was plenty of chance for advancement there. So the question was, as an 18-year-old, do I go with what I know is a solid future job, or do I go to this other thing which really attracts me? But I had no guarantee of success, and I have to admit there was a lot of but at home. Don't do that. That's stupid. And I just chose, I think maybe for the first time, to do what I wanted to do. So what I would say to myself is, as an 18-year-old, follow your heart. Don't let
Mm.
anybody else, even people who mean well, your parents and your friends, don't let them shy away. Don't let them make you shy away. Follow your dream. These days, I don't know whether that's possible because so much more is cataloged. But follow your heart. Take a chance. I've never
Mm.
regretted it.
Mm. That's great. Marilyn, do you have a piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
Yeah, but it's more like just, nobody ever discouraged me from being a writer. My mother voiced some doubt about whether it would pay enough to live on, but it turned out I earned a lot more than the teacher she wanted me to be. So that wasn't it. But I never paid much attention to the fact that I was a woman walking into a place where there were very few women. I didn't even think about it. It wasn't even on my mind. I just did what I wanted to do. And I kind of mostly have done what I wanted to do. I mean, until I got too old to do it. But I would just tell people to relax and just look forward and not backwards.
Mm.
Too many people are busy looking back to what they thought they could have been, should have been, would have been. And it's stupid. It's like carrying this heavy load with you wherever you go. Look
Mm.
forward, don't look back. You can't fix what happened. You can only fix the now.
Mm. Wow. That's both great pieces of advice. I think for anybody at any time, and take those chances and follow your dreams and look forward. It's yeah, that's great advice.
I think
Thank
that's
you
why
both so
Gary and
much.
I have lasted so long. I mean, we both have this sort of a attitude of, okay, that was the past. We're not in the past. We're in the present.
Yeah.
Let's just move on.
And like you said earlier, enjoy the moment and be in the moment
That's it.
and have
That's
fun.
it.
Yeah.
That's bigger than you can imagine, Brian.
Yeah.
I remember somewhere during my career I was in television by this time, and swapping letters or phone calls or whatever with people I had gone to school with, high school and college, and they would be telling me, "Well, what am I doing, Gary? Well, I don't want to brag, but I'm the assistant vice president, and I've got all of these pensions and things, and I've got two cars, and I'm going to be in six figures for the immediate future and beyond. I'm really
Mm.
happy with all that I've acquired." And I would say, "Oh, wow, that's great." And then the other person would say, "Well, what about you?" I would say, "Well, I really love what I'm doing." Yeah, I could
Mm.
have gone into I'm doing this story or that story or met this person or that person, but what came through to me really clearly was I love what I'm doing. And that makes all the difference. Not many people could say it then, fewer people can say it now.
Mm. Mm. One more hypothetical to sort of round it up. Technical issues aside, let's say you had an opportunity to be in Hempstead and be at the radio station now WRHU, and they said we'll give you an hour or two to be on the air. First part of the question is, would you be willing to do it? And the second part of it was, what kind of show would you want to do if you were back on the air?
Let me start because mine is simple. I really didn't like being on the air. I never liked it. I don't enjoy the sound of my own voice. I don't think I have a particularly good voice. And that's one of those things that I could very easily say, no, I'll watch. You need a script written, I'll write the script. But no thanks.
Okay. If you had a chance to write a script for something to be produced, would that be inspiring?
It could be. I mean,
Okay.
I've got in my ever present blog, I've got almost 20,000 posts.
Wow.
Any one of them could be a script.
Okay.
I mean, I've been doing this for 12 years. It's longer than I ever held a job for.
Wow. Very impressive. Okay. All right. Things to think about. Garry, would you get behind the microphone? Would you spin some records? What
Oh,
would you want to
hell
do?
yes. As Marilyn
He's
and others
he's
will
such a
say,
ham.
and I said it about myself earlier. I never met a camera or I never met a microphone I didn't like. First of all, I'm one of those who the personality changes. I go from being the mute guy to having a personality. Um, I think the show that I think, as I look back, that I enjoyed the most was the show that was called Night Song. It was the late night show that played the then popular contemporary music from the American Songbook. Um, what I would do is take that show and hopefully allow the music to have a greater role. That was where I learned how to segue, not only music but also how the scripts went. And I think I would do that now. Now, my only problem is the music that I enjoyed is no longer popular music, but we would work around that. But that's where I really enjoyed myself the most, and I found myself most creative. I learned from another alum, Bob Ring, who was I think, the original host of Night Song. And there was always a story behind the music, the songs. You could go from the film. The one with Audrey Hepburn and George Papad, Marilyn. Breakfast at Tiffany's, and of course, Moon River was the big song. And we had available back then Henry Mancini and the Mancini Choir, and then we had the instrumental version of Moon River. And the trick was to get out of the first version and into the second version so that it was pure poetry. You couldn't tell that you had left the first one.
Well, perhaps that could be in our futures. I want to thank you both so very much. I'm honored that you would take the time to share your stories, and I had such a great time. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Garry. This has been an honor and a thrill. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for doing what you're doing.